Feel free to skip around to the mechanic you're curious about if you want to. Okay, we'll start with the drive phase. So a straightened elbow creates the potential for more power. You can see in this video of Powell that when he comes off the block and he launches that arm back into the air, it's a straight elbow, or almost nearly straight. The reason for this is that while in the top end phase, you'll be mainly trying to maintain your speed, and thus you'll be trying to figure out ways to make your stride cycle as quick as possible because the mass will already be in motion. You don't have to accelerate anything. In the drive phase, you have to accelerate a stationary mass. And so to do that, you're going to have to create power. Now, essentially what happens is that by throwing the arm that's on the opposite side of the leg you're pushing with, by throwing that arm into the air, you're creating a counterforce to the force that you're pushing into the ground and that thus is coming back up into your body. Now, the way that this works is modeled here. You can see that the lat, this is the lat right here, it connects onto the same side hip. It connects down, boom, boom. It connects into the spine too, but onto the same side hip right here. Oh, mess that up. The same side hip. And so, say you're stepping with this leg right here on the right. You're stepping down and you're pressing that leg into the ground and you're sending all that force into the ground. All that force is coming back up through that leg into this hip. And this is the hip plane right here. It's trying to push this hip upwards. If there was no balancing force, the hip plane that's usually like this would turn and would tilt upwards just like that. And if that were to happen, the force would be lost. The time at impact would be lengthened, and so you'd basically be cushioning the blow at impact. To fix this, when this opposite lat, this is the leg, when this leg contracts and pushes into the ground, this lat right here contracts. All these fibers contract, and they pull on this part of the hip, the other side, and what that does is it balances it. So now, instead of just on this side, this is the hip plane, instead of just on that side it's being pulled up, on both sides it's being pulled up. And so the hip is balanced in that way. Now, with this in mind, the contraction of the lat needs to be timed with the force being sent into the ground and thus back up through the leg, or else the pelvis will not be stabilized. Now, to solve this timing problem, we should know that your stroke rate, or the time it takes you to complete each stroke, will start out at a minimum and it will quickly increase until it hits a maximum. Now you can see that in this graph here. This is the start of the race, and this over here is some amount of steps into the race. Now, the amount of strokes it will take you to reach your maximum stroke rate will vary from person to person. The actual time difference between each following stroke turns out to be pretty minimal, but you have to realize that the time difference created in the arm stroke by bending the elbow is proportionally small, albeit still necessary to time the arm stroke and the foot stroke together. Now, you can see here that Powell has obviously solved the timing problem. As the arm he launches back into the air reaches its peak height, the grounded leg reaches its max extension. And this is repeated with every stroke. As the arm extends fully, the leg extends fully, and thus the balancing of the hip is perfectly timed. With this in mind, if the elbow was flexed and the lats were to contract fully, bringing the elbow backwards, the arm would complete a stroke earlier than the legs could, and thus the counterforce would be mistimed. Thus, if you still want a maximally intense lat contraction, and thus a maximal counterforce, the optimal solution is to intensely contract the lat with a straightened arm, so that it actually takes longer for the arm to complete a stroke, and the stroke timing can be more easily synced with that of the legs. Now, in the same clip of Powell, you can see that as he picks up speed, as the mass moves further towards its maximal speed, his elbow angle shrinks with each step. As his legs reach max extension in a shorter amount of time, his arms reach max extension in a shorter amount of time because his elbow is more flexed. So he has every step, his first step almost maximally straightened, and then with each step his elbow angle decreases just a little bit until it reaches a sort of maximally flexed position. Also, the longer back arm and shortened front arm position allows you to balance your center of mass in the forward direction. You can see that in this video of Usain Bolt. As he comes off the blocks, his arms maximally straighten, and so you can think he's throwing this weight backwards, and thus his center of mass, which might otherwise might have been right here, and that might have been too far out in front, and he may have lost balance and fallen over. It's moved just a little bit, maybe like right there. And so although he's in the same angles for acceleration, his center of mass is more closer to the midline, sort of artificially. And so he can accelerate without losing balance and falling over. Like, to think about this mechanic, you can kind of imagine if you tried to start a sprint with your arms pinned to your sides, you wouldn't be able to reach the joint angles you need to accelerate optimally, because if you did, you'd just fall over on your face probably. And so the arms are sort of necessary for balance in that way. And you can kind of see what we were talking about earlier about the position of the center of mass out in front of the toes. In this clip, or in this picture, as his front foot hits the ground, you can see his center of mass is probably right there. and just out in front of the toes like that. And we'll talk about the reason for this sort of forward center of mass in just a little bit. Now, because of the position of the glutes on the skeleton, the most powerful hip extension is produced when the femur travels from a slightly adducted to a slightly abducted position. All this really means is that the leg travels a little bit towards the midline as it's being raised and loaded. You can see here, Powell's knee travels a little bit towards the midline, and then as he extends through foot strike, the knee travels a little bit away from the midline. It adducts and then it abducts. Because of this, a little bit of lateral force is produced. As you can see here, with each step, he sort of travels side to side a little bit. But the lateral force shouldn't really be feared that much because it's sort of a collateral damage in achieving maximal glute contraction, which you need to accelerate maximally. Now, the reason why this adduction to abduction pattern elicits the greatest contraction of the glute can be seen here. You can see this is the glute right here. It attaches up into the hip like this. It wraps around the leg like that. So you can imagine when this knee, if this knee, which is this knee, were to travel up just like that towards the midline, these glute fibers are being stretched and stretched and stretched as the femur travels up towards the midline like that. And so with these fibers stretched maximally, you allow the glute the most amount of range to fire through. And so you give it the greatest amount of range to produce power from. Now, this also corroborates with the speed versus power concept we were talking about earlier, because in almost every professional sprinter I've observed, the adduction to abduction lessens as they pick up speed and as the need for power lessens. Or it can be thought about as the need for speed maintenance increases. Because while you're allowing yourself the ability for more power by moving the knee towards the midline like that, it takes more time because you're firing through a greater range. And so it makes sense that as you speed up in the race, you sort of naturally start to adduct and abduct less to save time. Now, the optimal heel recovery mechanics are the same throughout the sprint. The quad relaxes and the foot stays directly behind the knee so that the shortest lever is being pulled. Now, you can see here in these diagrams what I mean by the foot being behind the knee. You can see that as the knee raises up in this arc right here, the foot will start to almost mimic that arc perfectly. So that's one way to think about it. Another way is that you're not actively trying to control the position of the foot. You're moving the knee up and the foot is being almost limply dragged behind it. Now, you can see on the left here, his foot is not being dragged directly behind his knee, and this is suboptimal. He has to exert more force to pull on a longer lever with his hip flexors to recover the foot, as you can see in this diagram down below here. Now, it might be easier to think about this in extremes. Like, think about if you were just standing and you're trying to raise your leg. It'd be a lot harder for you to raise this straight leg than it would be to raise this bent leg because the straight leg is such a longer lever. Now, this concept of low heel recovery, or keeping your foot low to the ground as you recover from the fully extended back to the fully flexed position, trying to execute this mechanic can lead to flaw because some people try to reach this low position to the ground by extending the knee out. And like we were just talking about, that leads to a longer lever that you have to lift. Now, a lot of people talk about this mechanic in relation to toe drag, which is the lowest heel recovery possible. It's literally dragging your foot on the ground. As you can see Asafa Powell do here off the start, he's dragging his back toe. Now, the reason why guys like Asafa Powell toe drag naturally is that they're able to generate such acute angles with such forward center of mass, the ground is in the way of their foot being directly behind their knee. Like if you look at this clip, if you look at his back leg, in order for him not to toe drag, he'd have to contract his hamstring and bring his foot up off the ground unnaturally. He's not intentionally using his quad to extend his foot into the ground. The ground is just in the way of his foot. And so this heel recovery position is optimal for him. In some, don't focus on dragging the toe. Focus on recovering the heel in a straight line with the knee. Now, shin angles are often talked about by coaches. It should be noted that the shin angle is only a mechanical byproduct of the position of the center of mass and the angle of the knee when the foot hits the ground. You can see in this video, as I accelerate, first of all, when I hit the ground, my shin angles are almost all the way vertical. Just very vertical when they hit the ground. You can see in these first and second steps here, almost all the way vertical. You can see with this extended knee angle, I'm not pushing the ground with my glute and my quad. I'm really pulling it with the glute and the hamstring. And because of that, it's less powerful. And we'll talk about why that is in a second. Now, this start clip of Christian Coleman is a good example of what true pushing mechanics look like. The hip extends before the knee, Coleman's center of mass is out in front of his toes, and thus his shins are near parallel with the ground. The further you shift your weight forward, the more parallel you'll be with the ground, and the easier you'll be able to achieve joint angles optimal for pushing. Once again, it is these mechanics working in combination with one another that create the ability to push the ground and not pull it. Okay, now we'll talk about the transition between the drive phase and the top end mechanics. You shouldn't try to time this transition because in reality, the transition begins the moment you push off the blocks and start developing speed. Now, you'll notice that as you develop speed, a few things will happen. For one, your knee will start to extend sooner in relation to the hip. When analyzing this video of Bromell, we can see that as he's pushing off, his hip is extending before his knee extends. You can see here, his hip extends and his knee stays at about the same angle, and it only extends once it pushes through the ground. When comparing that video to this video of Bolt, who's in the top end phase, we can see that as his femur reaches its maximum height and it starts to descend, in other words, as his hip starts to extend, his knee extends simultaneously. So he raises, and then boom, as his hip extends, his knee is extending almost immediately. So that's one change you'll start to see. Next, the angle of your knee when your foot strikes the ground will start to increase. We can see here in these two pictures of Trayvon Bromell that as he's starting, when his foot hits the ground, his knee is in this very flexed position, almost sub 90. And then as he reaches the top end phase, which is this bottom picture, his knee is very extended. Once again, not all the way extended, but very, very extended. Lastly, as the race develops and you pick up speed, you'll notice that your center of mass travels from just out in front of your toes to closer to your midline. You can see that here in these images of Asafa Powell. When he's just starting this race, this is maybe his first or second step, his center of mass floats out in front of his toes, as you can see right here. This is about 7 or 8 steps in. His center of mass has traveled slightly towards his center line. It's now within his toes. Now, maybe 30 yards in or so, his center of mass is almost all the way at his midline, and shortly after that, his center of mass is just about at his midline. Now, these changes will make sense when you realize that different mechanics are better at achieving different things. Top-end mechanics are better for maintaining higher speeds, and this is true because when the knee extends early, the body wields a longer lever and thus can move the end of the lever more in the same amount of time. Think about this. If you had a 1 mile long stick in your hand, imagine if you could move this stick parallel to the ground in 1 second. If you could move this stick, boom, still a mile, 1 mile. If you can move this stick, that's the starting point, parallel to the ground in 1 second. Your hands in here may only have moved, this may have been the starting point of your hands right here. Your hands may only have moved like 1 inch. That's 1 inch. But the end of the stick has moved more than a mile. So thinking of this phenomenon as it relates to sprinting, you can think of your hands as like your glute and your foot as the end of the lever. And so when your knee extends earlier and the lever grows long, the body can propel the foot backwards at much higher speeds than if we were using short lever acceleration. Now, while they're good for handling speed, top-end mechanics struggle to produce power under heavy loads. The straightened leg creates a longer lever to pull on, and thus it requires a greater force to generate the same power output into the ground, when one is not already in motion and having to propel stationary mass. When trying to think about why this is true, it's helpful to think of the body as a system of levers and fulcrums. Now, because this lever right here is so long, this guy right here is going to struggle more to lift that box, even though it weighs the same than this guy right here. And you can see this in action on the body. You can think of the hip joint as sort of the fulcrum, and the glute wraps from on top of the hip joint, sort of around here, to right below the hip joint, sort of right here. And so with this arrow, you can kind of see what the glute is trying to do. It's trying to pull this way. It's trying to pull this femur right here like that. And so because this leg or the lever is longer than it would be in the drive phase mechanics, it's more difficult to move load from that position. You can see that right here. In the top end, your leg is straight like this, and so your glute has to pull this entire lever. But in the drive phase, your leg is short, and so the length of the lever that your glute is pulling is really this distance right here. It's much shorter. Now, this is why drive phase mechanics are the body's natural power mechanics when sprinting. The shortened lever position created by the great bend in your knee makes it easier to lift the same load. Thus, you can think if you are at rest and put the same force through your leg once in drive mechanics and then again in top end mechanics, you would create more acceleration in the drive phase mechanic. Now, this is why it's optimal to have 2 different mechanical sequences when you're sprinting. You are inherently given 2 different problems to solve. First, you need to accelerate a load from rest, and then you need to maintain the speed at which that load is traveling. As mandated by the lever system that is the body, there's a specific solution to each problem, and we call those 2 solutions drive phase mechanics and top end mechanics. Thus, you should not transition intentionally. As you speed up, your body will naturally make the transitional adjustments mentioned earlier to accommodate for the new speed maintenance demands. Because speed acquisition is not instant, neither will be the transition. Knowing this, I advise you not to try to predict when you should start to transition, because truly the transition begins the instant you start to gain speed. Now, it's interesting to see that nature provides these same mechanics in other species. You can see in the clip of this cheetah trying to accelerate, you can see its back hip extends before its knee, and its knee pushes off the ground. The hip extends slightly, the hip extends, and then the knee extends. Then when the cheetah has already picked up speed, and it's in its top end phase, its knee extends as its hip is extending. So the knee comes up, femur reaches its maximal height, and then the hip starts to come down, and the knee comes down at the same time. Okay, now we'll talk about top end mechanics. Now, firstly in this clip of Bolt, you can see that in contrast to the drive phase mechanics where the hip extends first, in the top end, the knee extends as the hip extends. You can see the femur reaches its maximum height, and as it starts to extend, the knee extends with it. Now, this extension of the knee is not forced. It's natural because the glute pulls the femur down while the hamstring is only slightly contracted. Now you can see the knee extends until just before complete extension, and then it hits the ground in a slightly flexed position, and then it drives through from there. Now, while this is happening, the arms are still being driven back and forth, which means the opposite lats are still contracting. The distance that the elbow is displaced from the center line is much greater on the backstroke than it is on the forestroke. You can see that the displacement angle of the elbow closely mimics that of the same side hip. As the same side hip raises and reaches its maximally contracted point, the backstroking arm on the same side also reaches its maximal point. It's interesting, you can see that the angles that they reach are very similar, and they maintain the similarity throughout the stroke. Now, this is because by throwing the arm backwards into a long backstroke, you not only contract your lat more strongly, providing more balancing force to the pelvis, and thus allowing you to strike the ground harder, but you counterbalance the leg on the same side as the backstroking arm, the leg that's being raised in the air. This counterbalance helps to maintain the center of mass in the midline of the body. Now, an interesting observation is that those with a longer stride, those whose knee extends at a higher point, tend to have a longer backstroke of the arm, corroborating the counterbalancing point. You can see here in this clip, you can focus on Usain Bolt out front. You can see that his hip reaches a very flexed angle at the top, and so his knee extends at this very high position, and thus his stride is very long. Now, if you focus on Richard Thompson, who's in the red right next to him, you can see that his knee doesn't come up as far, and thus his stride is a bit shorter. Now, interestingly, when comparing the strokes of their arms, you can see that Usain Bolt's arms reach a much higher point on the backstroke than Richard Thompson's arms. Now, you can see in the forestroke here, as he brings his hand towards his chin, the shoulder is raised up. Now, what this does is it stretches the lat. It creates range in the lat. This range is used to create a more powerful backstroke of the arm, which increases the counterforce we were talking about earlier. Now, as this raised arm is thrown back into a backstroke, the shoulder is thrown down and the elbow angle expands. It's interesting to note that when analyzing the mechanics of sprinters, you'll see that the elbow expands simultaneously with the knee. You can see here in this clip, if you focus on Bolt, as his left leg is driven backwards right there, his right arm is driven backwards. And you can see that his right elbow expands just as his left knee is expanding. And this is done almost perfectly in sync. Now, the foot sequencing during top end mechanics should be discussed too. The foot strikes the ground in a slightly supinated position. This means the ankle is slightly everted as well as slightly plantar flexed. You can see this mechanic in this clip of Dario Horvat. He strikes the ground in this slightly supinated position. Now, once your foot strikes the ground, it rolls into a neutral position and begins to propel off. You'll see that it finishes in a slightly pronated position. So it lands supinated, rolls into neutral and begins to propel, and then finishes supinated. You can see this with Horvat here. He strikes supinated, he rolls into neutral and begins to push off, and then he ends slightly pronated. Now, by rolling the ankle in this way, you give your calf complex, and the system in general, time to absorb and transfer the force created by striking the ground, and thus you decrease the instantaneous force that your system has to handle. You can think of it sort of like punching a pillow that's in front of a wall instead of just punching the wall. Also, when the supinated foot hits the ground, the muscle that supinates the foot resists pronation and thus takes some of the load off the surrounding calf complex. You can see right here, as the foot hits the ground, this muscle right here is contracting and thus taking some of the force off the calf muscles and the Achilles. Now you can see everything we just talked about here in these images of Horvat. The foot supinates while it's in the air, it lands in that supinated position, it rolls and it launches from the neutral position, and then as it leaves the ground, it's in that pronated position. Now, top end heel recovery is a pretty simple mechanic, but it's important in setting up your next foot stroke. You can see here in these still images of Bolt, as his foot reaches the end of the range, his hip does as well. Now, when it comes to closing that angle with the abs and the hip flexors, and thus raising your leg and preparing it for the next stroke, you should realize that the closer your foot is to your glute, the shorter the lever is that you have to move, and thus the less force there is that's required to move it. Now, you can see here as the stroke progresses from image 1 to image 4 here, his foot trails directly behind his knee, and as his femur lifts, as you can see here, his foot almost touches his glute, and then still staying behind the knee, the angle releases as the femur is brought into the maximally raised position. Okay, finally, I'll talk about some general mechanics that occur throughout the sprint. Now, the calf complex's main function is isometric. When you push off in the drive phase or when you strike the ground in the top end phase, although the ankle does extend, by the time it does, most of the force has already been produced through an isometric position. Now, you can see what I mean here in this clip. You can see Powell in red here. You can really focus on any of the sprinters, but you can see that his ankle flexes a little bit when absorbing that force, but then almost all the force that he produces is produced through an isometric position. The ankle stays in the same angle throughout this push, and you see the ankle extends at the end there, but it's only once most of the force has been produced that the ankle does actually extend. And you can see that if you focus on any of the sprinters in this clip, you can see the same sort of thing happen. The ankle only extends after most of the force has already been produced. Now, that was in the drive phase. You can see the same thing though in the top end phase. Like focusing on DeGrasse on the far left, you can see that as he strikes the ground, boom, his ankle does flex a little bit to accept the force, but really the angle of his ankle joint stays basically the same throughout the stroke. And you can see that through all these sprints. It's not like they're hitting the ground and bouncing off, flexing with their foot like that. They're hitting the ground and they're producing force from a stiff position. And then only once they produce that force does their ankle actually extend. Now, the calf complex is elastic in that the body wants to hold a stiff position, and displacement from the stiff position creates energy that is released back into the ground. Larger displacements put the calf complex more at risk for injury and reduce power output, as energy from higher up in the chain, like the hips or the quads, is wasted in the backwards direction. Like we were talking about earlier in this Powell clip, his ankle displaces a little bit from the stiff position when he strikes the ground. His ankle flexes a bit and absorbing that force, and thus he loses a little bit of energy in the backwards direction. Now, it is hard to keep a completely stiff ankle just because when you're sprinting, you're putting so much force to the ground. But you should realize that to avoid injury and to improve performance, it's helpful to work on developing isometric strength in the ankle complex, so that while the ankle still generates the same amount of elastic force, it doesn't have to displace as far to handle that force. Now, throughout the sprint, your head should be positioned over your foot-to-foot strike. This creates a position in which your center of mass is directly over your propeller, your foot, and thus the least amount of energy is wasted laterally. You can see that here in the drive phase in this clip of Powell we were looking at earlier. With each step, his head is over the foot that's driving into the ground. Now, the same thing is seen in the top end phase. Here in this clip of Horvat we were looking at earlier, the head resides directly above whichever foot is striking the ground, and thus his mass is balanced over that foot. You can imagine, in an exaggerated example, if your head is like 10 inches to the right of your left foot, when your left foot hits the ground, unless your mass is displaced to the right, you either are going to push yourself off to the right with that step, or you're going to use some weird, inefficient movement sequence to maintain a forward direction. As mentioned with some mechanics earlier, most people do this naturally, so I advise you to only focus on maintaining the mechanic if you realize you don't perform it correctly. Now, I talked about this earlier, but I feel it's so important I want to make sure I articulate it well. From the moment you start to accelerate to the moment you reach top speed, your center of mass is shifting at a constant rate, starting from out in front of your toes when you start accelerating and finishing in the center of your body when you reach the top end of the sprint. Like if you were to look at a graph that tracks your center of mass throughout the race, it should track as a pretty fluid line. It shouldn't jolt up and down. It should track very fluidly throughout the race. You can see here in these pictures of Powell that we gathered earlier, if you were to keep track of his center of mass with a dot throughout the race, early in the race it would raise faster than it does in the later parts, but still throughout the race it's a pretty steady line. Now, the arch of the foot provides a few functions. Proper arch provides an elastic effect, storing tension when it's stretched at foot strike and then releasing it when the foot pushes off the ground. Also, a proper arch slightly supinates the foot in comparison to the flat arch position, setting the plantar fascia, the Achilles, and the rest of the calf complex in a straight line to deliver force more efficiently. Further with the feet, when your foot strikes the ground, your toes should probably be extended upwards. I say probably because I'm not exactly sure of the anatomical dynamic that creates the following effect, but I've seen anecdotally in both others and myself that when the toes are extended upwards, there's a greater capacity for plantar fascial contraction. In other words, it's easier to form the arch in the foot when the toes are extended upwards. Now, I don't think hand position, clenched or extended or limp or stiff, will have much of an effect on a sprint. You can see here in the clip of all these sprinters, some of them have clenched hands, some of them have flat hands, and some of them have a hand that's somewhere in between. Perhaps a stiff or a clenched hand would help to develop a stiff base to produce force from, emphasizing the counterbalancing connection between the opposite side glute and lat mentioned earlier, but even so, I don't think this effect would be large. Now, you should keep a neutral head position throughout the sprint. A push-forward head often rounds the shoulders with it, and this combined position usually prevents a sprinter's center of mass from reaching the midline of their body. Now, this prevents an extended leg from landing beneath the hips, instead landing out in front of the body. You can see this mechanic here in this video of me sprinting from a few months ago. You can see how pushed forward my head is in this clip, and you can see that even though I'm in the top end phase, when I strike the ground, my foot is significantly far out in front of my midline, and this is repeated with every step. As I strike the ground, my foot is, that's a pretty drastic example. You can see how far my head is pushed out in front of my midline right there. And this is repeated. Now, when you strike the ground out in front of your midline, it decreases the amount of top speed you can handle. As it decreases the hip range, you can generate limb speed within. The scapula protract and contract around the ribcage very slightly during a sprint, with the momentum of the arms bringing them forward and back a bit, but most of their motion is in elevation and depression, or moving up and down. If you focus on Bolt out in front in this clip, you can see that although his shoulders do move towards his chest and towards his back, protracting and contracting, the movement is pretty slight. The more significant movement is up and down, elevation and depression of the shoulder. As his foot strikes the ground, the same side shoulder reaches the lowest point, and then as it kicks back, the shoulder is bounced up in the air, creating that potential for power that we talked about earlier. And you can see this repeated with every stroke. His shoulder bounces up and down. And you can see the same mechanic in all the other sprinters here too. Lastly, I want to talk about a mechanic I'm not sure about, but seems important enough to include. It seems that in the acceleration phase, the lateral tilt of the hips oscillates with each stroke. What I mean by that is the tilt of the hips, as you can see here, the left hip tilting upwards versus the right hip tilting upwards, this changes with each stroke. Now you can see here in the start clip, if you focus on Powell in the red, you can see that as his knee raises in the air, it seems as if the same side hip raises up towards his shoulder a little bit, almost as if the obliques are crunching his hip up towards his shoulder. Now, it's not just the obliques crunching the hip up. As I forgot to mention earlier, it's not only the lat resisting hip tilt. It's actually the work of 4 main muscles working in conjunction with one another. And you can see all these muscles on these 2 diagrams. The lat, the erector spinae, the obliques, and finally the quadratus lumborum. Now, all of these muscles attach down into the hip, and they all work to resist tilt when you're walking or running. It's interesting, you can palpate these muscles while you're walking, and you can feel how they contract and release as you take steps. And then as he drives back into the ground, this crunching mechanism is reversed and his hip extends down towards the ground. Now, as you can see here, the hip seems to be slightly raised up and then slightly thrown back down towards the ground. Now, this would make sense as it creates more range in the body to produce power from. Interestingly enough, as the race goes on and sprinters pick up speed, the mechanic seems to lessen and lessen until the hips stay almost perfectly level. Like you can see here in the clip of this race, as these sprinters reach the top end phase, it's hard to distinguish any hip movement at all. It seems as if the hip plane stays almost perfectly level with each stroke. Now, because of the subtlety of this mechanic, it's sort of hard to determine its existence for fact without some movement tracking software, but it could be something that you play around with in your training.